Hi. Today it's raining in Phoenix. It's beautiful, but it's a little dreary. And I'm wondering, do you know how to suffer? What is suffering? I want to think about suffering today. And we can think about a kind of mental suffering or spiritual suffering. And we could think about a physical suffering. Either way, do you know how to do it? What is suffering? So let's talk about mental suffering first. There's a kind of suffering that happens for humans where we don't find meaning. We can't find meaning. Things don't make sense to us. We don't understand. And that's a kind of distress. It may be the worst kind of distress for us, especially if all of life is like that. Nothing makes sense, and it's increasingly senseless. We'll call this meaninglessness. And when life is like that, things get boring. Life can be boring, and that's intolerable for human beings. It's intolerable for rational beings. We are thinkers, and when we can't make sense of things, we need to fill it with something. And we invent things to fill it with. Maybe video games, maybe sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We need to fill that emptiness, that I've been calling it a God-shaped hole, the need for the infinite. We fill it with finite things and it isn't satisfying to us, and so we go into excess, and then we feel guilty about it. We have a kind of waste we've created with our own life. So meaninglessness, boredom, and guilt. Let's call that spiritual death. And that is the kind of suffering we are in and we can't tolerate. But that's really bad, but that's not the only kind of suffering there is. There's also physical suffering, toil, strife, old age, sickness, physical death. And sometimes these don't make sense to us. And when that kind of suffering doesn't make sense to us, it's compounded, right? Now we have this meaninglessness, and we're wondering about why all the waste in the world. But I want you to think about this. The toil, strife, old age, sickness, and death that we experience as human beings, perhaps that's a call for us to stop and think. Perhaps the purpose of that kind of suffering is to get us to think about the root cause of the first kind of suffering I mentioned. It is a call for us to stop and think about our view of the good life. Maybe when we suffer physically, our view of the good life is being shaken up. Maybe we think the good is comfort, and now I'm uncomfortable. What's going on here? I need to make sense of this. Why do others suffer? Why do children suffer? Maybe children suffer. I don't know if children suffer in the same way that adults do. Do they have the same way of self-awareness and being self-critical that we do? Do they go, why? Maybe children suffering is to get the adults to think. Maybe it's all for us to consider the meaning and purpose of life. So the very thing that we think is meaningless, suffering, has depth of meaning if we're willing to consider it. So, do you know how to suffer physically in a way that gets you to think about the root cause of the mental, spiritual suffering that we go through? And if so, then you're on a good track, because then suffering will make sense to you. But if suffering seems meaningless to you, then it won't serve you to get you to think about your own view of meaning. So suffering is a counter example to our own view of meaning. It's to get us to go, wait, is my view of meaning the real view of meaning? Does it match reality? I don't know. I hope that you don't fall into despair, and you don't fall into murmuring and complaining, or you don't harden yourself, because those are common responses to suffering. But I hope that suffering in the physical form gets you to go, what's my view of the good? And is it justified? And if it's not justified, should I think it through and find a better view of the good? So, suffering serves thinking. And that's why I brought it up in the context of thinking. So, let your suffering serve you well, my friends. All right, so today we talked about mental suffering and physical suffering. And physical suffering as a means to get you to stop and think about your view of the good. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And have a great day.